Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Carol Ann Duffy's book, The World's Wife. Carol Ann Duffy is probably one of my favorite contemporary poets. She does these persona poems, and I've talked about this actually before. I did a video called The Poetry of Carol Ann Duffy. Actually, some of the poems that I had talked about in that are in this collection, but this collection is vintage Carol Ann Duffy, the exact type of thing that she's really famous for doing, which is persona poems from women's perspectives, historical women, mythical women, biblical women, whatever it is. And one of the things that her work does, these persona poems do, is they provide a sort of counterpoint, an alternative perspective, what the scholar Jeremy Rawson calls minor character elaboration, in which the voices and the experiences and the perspectives of women are brought to the forefront in contrast to traditional fairy tales, myths, legends, histories, etc., which focus on the experiences of men and downplay or silence or ignore the experiences of women. So this book, again, contains poems inspired by fairy tales, like Little Red Cap, let me find other ones. Mrs. Beast is another one. From mythology, Penelope, Demeter, Eurydice, from the Bible, Salome, Pilate's wife, people like this. And then from history, Queen Herod, which is also a biblical one, of course, Anne Hathaway, Mrs. Darwin, Frau Freud, etc., etc. Again, people who their husbands are the ones whose perspectives we typically get, or the men in their lives. And a lot of these are very sort of sexualized experiences, or narratives, but often in ways in which women, the poet persona, the speaker of the poem, whoever that woman happens to be, is in some way gaining power or asserting power or passing judgment or something like this. So the first poem in the collection, the first one I'm going to read for you, is called Little Red Cap, and you'll see this. This is basically a version of Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Cap. At childhood end the houses petered out into playing fields, the factory allotments, kept like mistresses by kneeling married men, the silent railway line of the hermit's caravan, till you came at last to the edge of the woods. It was there that I first clapped eyes on the wolf. He stood in a clearing reading his verse out loud, in his wolfy drawl, a paperback in his hairy paw, red wine staining his bearded jaw. What big ears he had, what big eyes he had, what teeth. In the interval I made quite sure he spotted me. Sweet 16, never been, babe, waif, and bought me a drink. My first. You might ask why. Here's why. Poetry. The wolf, I know, would lead me deep into the woods, away from home, to a dark, tangled, thorny place, lit by the eyes of owls. I crawled in his wake. My stockings ripped to shreds, scraps of red from my blazer, snagged on twigs and branches, murder clues. I lost both shoes, but got there. Wolf's lair, better beware. Lesson 1 that night. Breath of the wolf in my ear was the love poem. I clung till dawn to his thrashing fur, for what little girl doesn't dearly love a wolf? Then I slid down between his heavy matted paws and went in search of a living bird, white dove, which flew straight from my hands to his open mouth. One bite, dead. How nice, breakfast in bed, he said, licking his chops. As soon as he slept, I crept to the back of the lair where a whole wall was crimson gold aglow with books. Words were truly alive on the tongue, in the head, warm beating, frantic, winged music and blood. But then I was young, and it took 10 years in the woods to tell that a mushroom stoppers the mouth of a buried corpse, that birds are the uttered thoughts of trees, that a graying wolf howls the same old song at the moon year in, year out. Season after season, same rhyme, same reason. I took an axe to a willow to see how it wept. I took an axe to a salmon to see how it leapt. I took an axe to the wolf as he slept, one chop scrotum to throat, and saw the glistening virgin white of my grandmother's bones. I filled his old belly with stones, I stitched him up. Out of the forest I came with my flowers, singing, all alone. And so again, there is this very sort of sexual element to this, right? The ripped stockings, the thrashing fur, the wolf's breath in her ear all night, etc., etc. And yet, it is ultimately a version of the story told from the perspective of Little Red Riding Hood, in which she is in control of her own destiny, basically throughout the story. She is not a victim of the wolf. She instead sort of engineers things in such a way that that she gets what she wants from the wolf. And this is sort of often the case with these poems, is the woman is able to get what she wants, to get the thing that she desires, or to pass judgment on the man. So I'll read you this one. This is more of a it's a passing judgment poem, but it's also a poem in which the woman again is empowered in a way that the man in the story is not. So this is Pilate's wife. Firstly, his hands, a woman's, softer than mine, with pearly nails like shells from Galilee, indolent hands, camp hands that clapped for grapes. Their pale mothy touch made me flinch. Pontius. I longed for Rome, home, someone else. When the Nazarene entered Jerusalem, my maid and I crept out, bored stiff, disguised, and joined the frenzied crowd. I tripped, clutched the bridle of an ass, looked up, and there he was. His face, ugly, talented. He looked at me. I mean, he looked at me. My God, his eyes were eyes to die for. Then he was gone, his rough men shouldering a pathway to the gates. The night before his trial, I dreamt of him. His brown hands touched me. Then it hurt. Then blood. I saw that each tough palm was skewered by a nail. I woke up, sweating, sexual, terrified. Leave him alone. I sent a warning note, then quickly dressed. When I arrived, the Nazarene was crowned with thorns. The crowd was baying for Barabbas. Pilate saw me, looked away, then carefully turned up his sleeves and slowly washed his useless perfumed hands. They seized the prophet then and dragged him out to the place of skulls. My maid knows all the rest. Was he God? Of course not. Pilate believed he was. Now, what I actually find really interesting about this one is the depiction of Pontius Pilate as this sort of weak, effeminate, soft guy, which is almost certainly not historically true. Pontius Pilate was a soldier. He was a military governor. He would have been extremely tough. He would have been a seasoned soldier, and so I think it is a really interesting way of depicting this character. And it definitely sort of departs from these questions of historical verisimilitude to instead create a distinct impression of the character intended. So I think that's really interesting. I'm going to read you a couple more very short sort of judgment ones. And these are ones that I think do a really good job also illustrating Duffy's humor, her ability to be incredibly funny. So this is a poem called Mrs. Icarus. Very short one. Mrs. Icarus. I'm not the first or the last to stand on a hillock watching the man she married prove to the world he's a total, utter, absolute grade A pillock. Just a very funny one, very short. But again, I think this is one of the beautiful things about Duffy's poetry, is that it is insightful and challenges the ways we tend to be told stories, myths, legends, histories, etc., fairy tales, etc., etc., by offering these sort of alternate perspectives on the events going on in these really interesting ways. The other one I want to read you is Mrs. Darwin. And again, this is a very short one, very, 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 very funny one. Mrs. Darwin. 7th April, 1852. Went to the zoo. I said to him, something about that chimpanzee over there reminds me of you. Yeah, I think it's just a very, very funny poem. I think it's really, really delightful. And again, I love Carol Ann Duffy. I love these persona poems. I love these sort of reimaginings of these stories and the feminist slant she puts on them. It's amazingly good.